Welcome to Shadowed Secrets, where the darkest mysteries are revealed. Every short story we tell will take you deeper into the unexplained, unsolved, and the terrifying truths hidden in the shadows. From haunting tales to real-life horrors, these stories are designed to make you question what you think you know and keep you awake at night. If you're ready for chills, suspense, and shadowed secrets that lurk in the dark, hit that subscribe button now, and let's dive into the unknown together. Hello everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm sorry that I haven't really been able to post an update in the last 2 weeks about how I've been doing, but I wanted to give you an update now. So I'm feeling much better also. My Ferrat Topaz, the EY drop regimen that we had her on, for her melting ulcer in her eye, it seems to have helped a lot, and it looks like she's going to be able to keep her eye. So that's awesome. I'm really happy about that. This last week and a half I've been dealing with some issues with my computer and with my mixer, so it's just been like a bunch of things in this last month that have been all happening at the same time and making it really hard to work on stuff, but I've got all that fixed. I'm feeling better. I'm not going to be needing to do the eye drops for my Farah anymore every few hours like I've been doing as of today. Actually, after I post this video, I'm going down for her final vet appointment. But yeah, I'm going to be getting back on normal uploads this week. The next video I'm going to be posting will probably be on Thursday, and it's going to be a story by C.K. Walker, who wrote Barasa, and it's called Mayhem Mountain. And I still have some work I need to do on Barasa. It's kind of been put off with all this other stuff I've been doing, but I'm going to get back on working on that since it's such a long project. There are a few other shorter stories I want to get out in the meantime, just to kind of get back into the swing of things, but I do still plan to have that up soon. And I just want to say again, thank you all so much for being patient with me while I've been going through this stuff lately. I'm excited to get back into normal uploads. But for this video today, this is a paranormal compilation. Once I get back into regular uploads this week, you probably won't see nearly as many compilations. I want to get back into just posting singular stories again. And I might do compilations every now and again, but for the most part going forward, you'll probably mainly only see singular stories like I normally do. And one of the stories in this one is actually in like my top 5 favorite stories of all time. I've mentioned it a few times, so I'm excited to see if any of you can guess what it is in the comments. But with that said, I'll be replying on the comments like I normally am, and I hope you have a great day. I've never really considered myself to be much of an explorer or a particularly brave man. However, that hasn't seemed to stop me from getting into the predicament I'm in now. It was around 3 months ago that my girlfriend of 4 years left me for another man, and she really was the last tether keeping me grounded to any semblance of a social life. Don't get me wrong, I have friends that I love to see, but most live across the Metroplex about an hour's drive, so it's a rare day when I make the effort to drive out there. And even more rare to have them drive out to see me. Over the past 3 months, I've gone through most of the stages of a breakup: sorrow, self-pity, hopelessness, and anger. But after taking a look at myself, I decided there were a few things I could improve. And although I'm not in a particularly bad shape, I wanted to sculpt my physique to something more attractive to women. This is a problem, as I'm a fairly lazy man. Not everything in my life has been handed to me, but I've learned to put the least amount of effort into any and all activities as possible. So rather than buying a gym membership and taking the 5-minute drive down the road, I decided I'd simply build myself a home workout center and do some A/B blasting in my apartment. I only recently moved into this place about a month before my ex left me sharing a 2-bedroom with absolutely no one. It lies in the far corner of the complex on the second story, and the balcony gives me an excellent view of the enormous soccer fields and the woods beyond that. The only problem is that the landlady lives underneath me, and I learned fairly quickly that the whole home gym setup was a bust, as almost immediately when doing reps with the weights I bought, I heard the crotchety woman banging on the floor with a broom handle, commanding me to keep it down, as irritating as it was, walking on eggshells all the time. I suppose it was understandable, so I opted to cut corners some other way, and rather than doing the smart thing and hitting the gym, my eyes turned to the vast fields at my very doorstep. The fields were simply massive, stretching back several hundred yards, surrounded by dense wood on all sides, other than the front, which faced my apartment, and the equally large parking lot, which was sunken in such a way as to be unseen from the main road that led to it. It was October when I first checked out the fields. I live in Texas, so it doesn't get cold here until December, if at all. So I had plenty of time to get familiar with the area before winter hit. I only went at night, preferably past midnight, or even one colored. When the large floodlights were shut down and all the late-night teenagers were done with their shenanigans, I would slip through the decrepit fence that shoddily guarded my apartment and disappear into the night. And during this time, I felt amazing, completely uninhibited and alone, just the way I liked it. I would bring out my weights, do laps around the field, and heck, I even brought a few buddies out there once or twice to have some drinks and play soccer once it had cleared out. And although I will admit going out there in the pitch black lone with nothing but the moonlight and could be slightly unnerving at times, it was far better than the alternative, at least at first as my isolation grew. My sleep schedule strayed from the norm, and it wasn't long before I found myself awake at odd hours of the night. Even now, I'm recording this at 2 a.m. And about a week ago was a particularly rough one. After fruitlessly lying in bed for almost an hour and not even feeling my eyelids flutter once I realized my efforts to fall asleep were futile, and I found myself crawling out of bed at 1 in the morning. It's strange many of the times I find myself drawn to the field. It's almost as if I'm not in control of my body or even my own thoughts. And as I threw on a jacket in preparation for the chilly embrace outside, I glanced outside my bedroom window, finding to my amusement that the floodlights in the field were still on. Because it was so late, I figured one of the workers must have forgot to turn off the lights for the night, and initially thought little of it. I grabbed my phone and headed outside. I was feeling strangely courageous that night, confidently strutting out onto the barren field, dropping off my shirt and jackets near the edge, feeling like the biggest man in the world. And after putting on some music on my phone, I headed to the center of the wasteland, halfway expecting to see someone out there waiting for me. The overpowering luminescence of the floodlights combined with the sharp contrast of the utter and complete darkness of the forest encompassing it made for an odd sensation indeed. But I still found myself walking to the center of the field and simply observing my surroundings in the darkness in the early hours of the morning. It is easy for one's mind to play tricks on them, and it was not uncommon for me in the past to do a double take over my shoulder whenever I thought I saw a shadow sprinting through the night, only to see a harmless flag or feel a wave of fear crawl up my spine when I heard the rustling behind me, only to discover a plastic bag in the breeze. But this night felt different. The glaring light cast long, dark shadows across the field, and as I marched around cold and alone with only David Bowie blaring from my phone to keep me company, I felt remarkably uncomfortable. After kicking a soccer ball around the field for less than 5 minutes, a strong gust of wind hit my shortless body, leaving me shuddering involuntarily. But this was met by a loud, clanging sound of metal on metal from the woods at the edge of the field. which halted my shuddering almost immediately as I stood still as a statue with goosebumps quickly forming up my arms. As I mentioned, it was not uncommon for there to be noises around the field even at night, and I quickly rationalized that the wind had knocked something against a large metal garbage can at the edge of the field. And I continued with my workout, still in the zone, but alert David Bowie abruptly shut off, jarring me into glancing at my phone. Damn it, I thought out loud. The battery had died. That's when I heard the clanging noise again, and my head snapped back towards where I perceived the noise to have originated from. I waited several seconds. Know why this time, for those who don't know. In a large field like this, it's nearly impossible to pinpoint just where a noise is coming from because of the effect echoes can have in such a wide, unobstructed space. But I had the distinct feeling it was not coming from the garbage can. At the other end of the field, I had enough fun for the night. Without glancing back, I put my phone in my pocket and started jogging away from the center of the field and back towards the hole in the fence that led directly to my apartment. And that's when it happened. The floodlights went out. I kid you not, every single one of the lights turned off instantly here. I was damn near naked eyes, watering from the cold and goosebumps, covering every inch of my body when darkness took the field. That's when my jog turned into a sprint. I felt exposed, alone, and oh so vulnerable. I'm not a feeble or cowardly man, but I knew anyone or anything out there messing with me, so late at night had to have been crazier than I was. I still had about 100 yards to run when I glanced behind me. I don't know whether to be grateful or terrified that I saw nothing in the shadows of the night, but either way I ran harder and faster than I had in a long time. My terror was so severe, I completely forgot to grab my shirt or jacket, both of which were Christmas presents, but immediate relief overtook me once I entered the premise of the complex, squeezing through the broken fence, racing up the stairs and slamming and locking the door behind me. Breathing heavily, I stumbled over to the kitchen table, my legs and lungs both burning with a white-hot pain. I was shaken, but I was all right. I threw on a shirt, almost completely forgetting about the one I left behind, and started to boil some water for tea when I knew I could finally relax, and that's when I heard it. 3 knocks on my door, my front door at 2. In the morning, law enforcement, that was the first thought I had. They had finally busted me for trespassing all those times, but I figured if I just calmly explained myself, maybe they'd let me off with a warning. I walked over to my door and grabbed my doorknob, but something stopped me from turning and pulling it open instead. I lowered my eye to the circular peephole in the door, figuring I might as well see who it was. Before I opened, I shakily backed away from the door with goosebumps immediately re-emerging on my arms and neck as the familiar sensation of dread radiated throughout my body. I glanced at the door to make sure it was locked, and for good measure, I ran up and threw on the deadbolt, when a second series of thumps reverberated throughout my small apartment. My view of the people had been completely black, meaning someone had covered it for a reason that God only knew, but it couldn't have been good. I went out to get my jacket and shirt the next day when the sun was high in the sky, bringing some semblance of warmth and order to the world. The field was full of parents and kids happily playing soccer, but my articles were gone along with any sign that anyone or anything was even out there the night before. That was 5 days ago, and every night since the lights in the field have remained on until 2, without fail, and every single night, at the same time I hear that metallic clanging in the field, whether there be wind or not, followed soon after by that familiar thooing at my door. I suppose going directly to my apartment immediately after was a poor choice, as now, whatever is out there in that field knows who I am and where I live. I don't know what to do. I think maybe I should move back in with my parents. I don't know, I need to get away, and I'm terrified. It was this morning that really sent me over the edge. I opened my door at 8 and in order to head to work, when I nearly stepped on something, I picked up the ragged piece of cloth apprehensively, thinking it might be the garment of some homeless vagrant, when it dawned on me, although horribly mutilated and torn to shreds, it was still recognizable. I dropped the cloth in horror. It was my jacket. Even now, as I record this, I regret to inform you I hear it. The house sat empty at the top of the hill. Its security lights were a beacon in the night, like a lighthouse alone in the mist. Warning ships away from the kiss of sharp shores. The closest neighbor was further away than a man could throw a rock, a fact that didn't appear to be a coincidence inside its smooth walls. Grey hardwood spread out across an expansive single floor. The leather furniture decorating the space and looked like someone's idea of a futuristic catcher mitt, and felt half as cozy chosen as was the case for much of the house for colour. More than comfort, doubly so for the tank of tropical fish that shimmered against the far accent wall. Its 40-odd gallons of water sparkled in the dark, cared for by a professional who came out to the house on alternating Tuesdays. Overhead spotlights clicked to life. They were triggered by the abrupt opening of the heavy front door. A burst of cold air was followed into the house by Douglas, the owner. He shut the door just as quickly as it had swung open, his grey, unblinking eyes flecked with bits of blue. 3 hard clacks in the door was locked, 4 beeps and the alarm system was activated in the kitchen. Douglas stood at the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of water, drinking it down in one gulp, then did the same with a scotch. He was thirsty and had been for some time. His nerves were on fire and needed extinguishing after another scotch, this one over ice. He drew the blinds and ran the shower until the mirror couldn't be seen. Then he undressed and stepped in under the hot water. Douglas kneaded his sore neck like a baker working a tough batch of dough. 3 days now it had been stiff. 3 days of limited movement, of waking in the mornings with a cry. The rub helped, but he knew within 20 minutes of getting out of the shower, his neck would be back to the way it had been before a masseuse was in order. He thought to himself, one of those cute girls he always passed by at the gym. The thought alone was enough to relax him. The little hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stood up. He felt the unmistakable presence of a man standing just behind him. He rubbed the water from his eyes to catch the intruder in the act, ready to pounce on him in a commotion of fists, but he was alone in the steamy shower, and though the feeling faded the longer he kept his eyes open, Douglas swore he could feel subtle changes in the direction of the air shifts, so slight they didn't even move the shower curtain, almost like breathing yet. Soundless and cold, ready for bed. Dugas turned off all of the lights in the house as he went from room to room. He checked the windows to make sure they were locked properly. Noting with some comfort the wires of the house's alarm system, he had settled into a decent state after 2 large scotches in a hot shower, and he looked forward to a good night's sleep for a change. He crept into the bedroom, slipped between the cool covers, and let his eyes close of their own accord. The house was quiet, secure a few odd moments in the shower. Notwithstanding, Douglas felt the closest to content he could expect. Already the silken kiss of sleep was swallowing him down, like sinking into the warm sap of 1,000 billowing trees. Taste like a whisper in his ear. He jolted awake at the man's voice, with it the sensation of breath on his face. A moment later came the loud bang of something hitting his bedroom window from the outside. First the impact, then the shimmy of glass dancing in its frame. It sounded like a fist had pounded at the window. He threw the covers off and jumped out of bed, looked around the room for whoever had whispered to him. Once he was sure he was alone, he yanked the curtains open. No one, just his front yard, a hill which sloped down to the empty street, all of it blanketed in yellow-white moonlight. Douglas leaned in close to look under the window. Possibly the trespasser had ducked down and was hiding against the house tucked in behind the airless. A blackbird twitched in the grass. Its wings flapped in erratic rhythm, and its legs were two hardened sticks Douglas looked for and found a sign that the bird had hit his window. An impression of the animal's shape had been left behind, a fine silhouette rendered in dust, the body at the center, and two feathery wings spread outward. The bird continued to twitch in the grass until the movement slowed, its solid black eyes finally drained of sight, left to stare unfocused into the sky. Douglas watched the bird die. Then he returned to bed. The autumn sun slept behind a coat of clouds. Meanwhile, some people had to work. Douglas stood at the water cooler down the hall from his office, repeatedly refilling and draining a cone-shaped paper cup. He was still thirsty despite a good night's sleep each time he drank. He watched the bubbles rise up from somewhere unseen and wobble to the top of the water jug. The sight was hypnotic at some point. He lost the need to blink. "Hey, what happened to you Friday?" Douglas looked up from the dancing bubbles. Peter from marketing had walked into the break room unnoticed and was eyeing Douglas with light contempt. "What, you were supposed to meet us at M. Peter explained for drinks on Friday." "Oh, sorry about that," Douglas managed as much as he tried to think of an excuse for not going. He couldn't come up with anything sufficient, but said you should worry about, he likes the whole team. Socializing, kiss the boss's ass thing. If you keep no-showing, he'll rethink the promotion. Douglas nodded distantly. He raised his paper cup. "Does this water taste funny to you?" "I don't drink water. I drink coffee." Like God intended with that. Peter left the break room and resumed his blonde life. Douglas filled his cup and finished it one more time. Doing his best to pin down the familiar taste back in his office, he tried to lose himself in work. He became absorbed by emails and faxes and reports, but he found himself unable to commit fully to the moment, fighting the feeling that someone was looking over his shoulder, checking his progress. Before he made any more than once, he typed out a word, only to delete it, then retype it exactly as it originally appeared. The second guessing put him on edge. Eventually, he gave up the idea of completing the task altogether. He sat back in his chair, rubbed his ears, smoothed his tie and surveyed the battlefield. Suits glided past his doorway somewhere down the hall. A fluorescent bulb sounded out its electric death rattle on his desk. Facing the empty chair opposite him was a nameplate some grateful client had bought him a few years back. He rarely looked at it anymore, as was the case for any non-functional object that sat on his desk for more than a month. He leaned forward and spun the nameplate to read the inscription. The thin strip of horizontal metal was engraved with his name, Douglas, first name only. Underneath, in smaller font, it gave the origin of the name from the Scottish surname Douglas, meaning dark river. Douglas grimaced. He put the nameplate back where he'd found it, this time face down. 2 hours later, after further failed attempts to accomplish something, he left for the day. As he crossed the parking lot, one of his co-workers leaned against her red Import, a cigarette burning between her lips. "Hey Doug, you got a new car?" It's Doug, and it's a loaner," he replied, not bothering to explain further. She watched him pull out of the parking lot and drive toward the setting sun. Taking another long drag of peppermint smoke, she wondered what Ed had ever seen in him. Douglas drove in silence. Occasionally, he chewed his thumbnail or checked the radio for a good song, but every sound that came out of the speakers grated on him until he decided he no longer liked music. Meanwhile, the dealership mechanic's voice echoed in his crowded head. "That must have been some deer," the man had said, rubbing his grey palms together as he inspected the damage. A flash of scared eyes crossed Douglas's mind, deep points of terror, old black. He had said nothing to the man, simply left him to his work. As night kicked in like a bad pill, he drove past the river, which intertwined through the large stretch of land outside the city. It had always served as a checkpoint in his commute, one of the telltale signs of leaving behind the throngs of rude and uncaring city streets. Now it signaled something else entirely. The light of 1,000 stars above was snuffed out in its cold water. He pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to pass the river without making eye contact. A few minutes later, he entered the tunnel beneath the river. The passage was made of steel arches sprayed with concrete and covered by brick. It had been an unappreciated addition to the city's history, marred early on by an accident during construction that killed 3 men. Though the incident had occurred long before Douglas was born, he shared a distaste for this part of his commute. He had never enjoyed being underground, believing it unnatural. There were signs warning of construction today, and sure enough, as he rounded the bend, he saw flashing lights reflected against the wall. Beastly yellow and white vehicles filled the tunnel, with men in reflective coats directing traffic. One of the larger men held up a sign reading "Slow," letting cars pass one at a time. Just as Douglas was about to make his pass, the man flipped the sign to say, "Stop." "Come on," Douglas sighed. The heavy-set man made his way over and signaled for Douglas to lower his window. "Only take a minute," the man declared. "You can't let me pass?" Douglas asked. "Nope, someone's got to wait while we fix it." Douglas reluctantly put the car in park, checked his phone. No service. Moments later, the tunnel lights went out. A loud buzz echoed through the tunnel as the power cut out. Darkness as thick as paint swallowed everything. Men shouted in the shadows, and Douglas felt his stomach drop. His fear of the underground had come true. After a few seconds, yellow emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim glow. Workers scrambled to restore power, but Douglas felt something behind him, a presence. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the dark thoughts. Then a cold finger seemed to trace a line up his neck. He shivered and cursed himself for letting his mind wander into such dark places. But then he heard a whisper from the back seat. "Tastes like salt." He ignored it. Another voice murmured, "So thirsty." His leg began to shake and he pressed it hard, willing himself to stay calm. Suddenly, the tunnel lights came back on and the power returned with a hum. Relieved, Douglas opened his eyes. Glancing in the rearview mirror, his heart froze. There was a face. Hollow eyes stared back at him, dark, wet hair clinging to slick skin. The man's lips parted and dirty water poured out. Panicked, Douglas spun around, but there was nothing in the back seat. Just an ice scraper on the floor. His heart pounded as he tried to steady his breathing. Outside, the construction worker waved at him, signaling he could go. Douglas nodded and drove away in silence, the memory of the face in the mirror haunting him. His mouth was as dry as burnt paper, and he resolved to drink until either his throat or his legs gave out. That night, Douglas dreamed. He walked through a dark field at night, the grass black as oil and stretching to the horizon. In the windless expanse, the dirt beneath his bare feet was black, reminiscent of potting soil but not as damp. There was no moon in the sky nor direction in his heart. He simply walked, lifeless dirt between his toes. Birds, unseen in the grass, stirred if he strained to see them, moments of black feathers twitching between the blades. Their eyes were like voids, filled only with hurt. Douglas stopped as he spotted a man lying on the ground ahead, his face buried in the dirt. The man's clothes were soaked, and a puddle of what he hoped was water had formed around him. "Are you okay?" Douglas asked, without moving his lips, but the man didn't answer. Moving closer, he repeated the question, yet the man still remained silent. "This time, though," he answered. His voice was the dry crunch of gravel underfoot. "So thirsty?" A loud knock woke Douglas, and he spasmed in his chair, giving out a shout. "Whoa!" Peter stood in the doorway, prompting Douglas to look around his office and situate himself, realizing he had dozed off behind his desk again. He shook his head and apologized, noting that noises had been setting him off lately. Peter gave him a condescending look. "You need to relax. Just a friendly tip. No one likes a guy who gets stressed easily, especially Ed." He peeked down the hallway to see if anyone else had witnessed the incident, particularly Ed. Douglas rubbed his heavy eyes. "I think I need to get away for a bit." You hit the reset button," Peter replied, stepping into the office and lowering his voice. "Are you crazy? You can't go on vacation right now, not with everything going on." He paused to scratch his nose, then smiled. "What is it?" Douglas inquired. Peter nodded. "I know just the thing." As Douglas took a seat in the small waiting room, a pretty girl emerged from behind the welcome desk and handed him a clipboard. It held a release form printed on both sides of one page, with a pen clipped to the top bearing the place's name, Deep Escape. "Standard stuff," the girl said. "Not liable for anything, blah blah blah." She smiled and returned to her desk, where she kept her phone hidden behind the computer monitor. Douglas filled out the form on autopilot. If you've read one, you've read them all. Meanwhile, Peter's words echoed in his head. "Did I ever tell you about my brother? The poor guy came back from Iraq with shell shock. I'm not sure what they do exactly, but it's some kind of isolation, no sound, no sight." He recalled that his brother had tripped out a bit at first, but by the end he felt like he'd slept for a year. Douglas didn't care what they did as long as it worked. He was tired of being anxious about being tired. His mind just needed a little break before it broke. There was no such thing as unseen presences or disembodied voices, just the very real effects of stress on the brain. He knew he had to treat it in very real ways. Skipping over all the disclaimers, he signed on the line. Before long, he was standing in a private room the size of a bedroom, while an attendant explained the white beast in front of him. "When you enter isolation," the young man explained, "you're in the darkest place in the world." The apparatus was the width of a large bed and twice as high, enclosed on all sides with a slanted front wall where the door was located. The door had a handle on its left side to open it, along with two larger ones on the body to hold while climbing in. The attendant explained everything about the treatment, how to get the most from the experience and which specific parts of the brain it stimulated. But Douglas was only marginally aware of him until he asked if Douglas was ready. Nodding in response, the attendant showed him where to hang his clothes and left him alone in the tiled room, naked, with his clothes folded on a small bench. He opened the white beast and stepped inside. The water was set to skin temperature, making the transition easy. It was like slipping into a second skin, a friendly hand that welcomed him and took him in safely. A deep voice inside warned him not to get in, not to do this, but already the smooth water had won him over completely. Inside, he crouched down low and pulled the small door shut behind him. Dark, true dark, was as unfamiliar to him as it was for most accustomed to ambient light. His eyes, from sun to moon, starlight to streetlight, struggled to make sense of the complete absence of stimulation. Douglas found the first minute of this new darkness dizzying, and only lay down in the shallow water when he felt comfortable enough to move. To his surprise, he floated easier than normal. He recalled the attendant mentioning something special about the water, which gave it that characteristic. As the shadows settled around him and the water no longer sloshed against the side of the tank, his ears fought to understand the loss of constant input, soon followed by his skin. He lost all sense of time passing. Soon, his eyes began to create a show for themselves. Flashes of light formed and swirled above him, and he watched them like a child does a fireworks display. Beautiful bursts of color exploded before his eyes, at their center set like a jewel. A tiny dot of black that grew until its true shape became clear, an eye wide open. The black pupil at the center expanded until it overtook the outer colors, completely surrounded by pure black. Once again, he was jarred by the deafening sound of impact that filled his eardrums, like a bird smashing into a bedroom window or the world coming crashing down. He was pulled into the black, all-encompassing pupil, and out the other side where his hand struggled to regain control of a steering wheel. There was a long crack in the windshield like lightning splitting the glass. At one jagged junction, a bit of something black broke from the shattered pane. Douglas watched with detached horror, his body burning with adrenaline, his eyes stinging with tears. In a moment, everything had changed. Sticking out from the glass, waving in the wind, was hair. He checked the rear view after swerving noisily a few times. The car had ended up on the side of the road where the river snaked close to the shoulder. There were no other cars on the road, normal for this time of night. He put the car into park, turned the key, and slowly got out. His legs felt uneven, his body unfit for walking, and he came around the front of the car, expecting the worst. A man lay on the ground ahead, his face buried in the dirt. "Are you okay?" Douglas called out, but received no answer. He repeated the question, and this time, the man began to move his lips. Rushing to his side, Douglas turned him onto his back so he could breathe, propping the man's head up in his lap. "Relax, it's okay," Douglas said, holding him steady. "What do you need?" he asked, but the man's voice cut out painfully, each word a tremendous effort. "Please." After a quick shower at home, Douglas poured himself a drink to calm his nerves before heading back to Muin. "If I call the police now..." "I already called them," Douglas interrupted. "We have to sit and wait." "They told me to wait." Just then, the man began to cough. "What do you need?" Douglas asked again. "I'm thirsty," the man replied weakly. Glancing over his shoulder, Douglas noticed how close they were to the river, its water churning over small, smooth rocks. He tried to lay the man's head on the grass, but each movement caused the man to scream in agony. Instead, Douglas carefully dragged him backward, grunting and sweating until his legs were submerged in the river. Cradling the man's bleeding head with one hand to keep it from dipping into the water, Douglas scooped up some cold water with the other and brought it to his lips. "It tastes like salt," the man complained. Douglas tasted the water himself, but found it was just fresh water. "It's a river," he insisted. "It's fresh water." "It tastes like salt," the man repeated, taking another sip and looking up at Douglas, struggling to breathe. "When are they coming?" he asked. Douglas paused. "Soon. Just relax." The man's gut rose and fell like waves as Douglas scooped up more water. "What did you do?" the man gasped. Douglas's hand stopped. The man's wide eyes stared up at him accusingly. Douglas felt a surge of annoyance. "Of course I called. Call again. There's no point." "They're already coming." The two men locked eyes, understanding each other too well. In that moment, their lifelines tangled like bad wires, the river gurgling and splashing around them, pushing past their bodies as time stretched infinitely. The man took a deep breath, the night air filling his lungs, and opened his mouth to scream for help. But Douglas pushed the man's head under the surface. The scream became bubbles, lost in the frigid torrent of river water. He wouldn't let this stranger ruin his life. The unwelcome weight that had hit his bumper and bounced off his windshield, the man who thrashed and swallowed the river, eyes wide open. Douglas opened his eyes and found himself back in the dark tank of Deep Escape, floating in space, but he wasn't alone. Something was in there with him, crouched over him, a presence, a sound, a body without a body that had been following him. Cold fingers wrapped around his neck, pushing him down underwater. Looking up from the dark water to the dark sky, he could make out the man's face above him. No surprise, his lungs and eyes burned as he gasped for air. He took in mouthfuls of water, his vision fading, and recalled the attendant's warning about the water. In order for you to stay afloat, the water is treated with Epsom salt. It tasted like salt. Tight fingers squeezed his throat shut, turning his vision black, blacker than the water that swallowed him down. You're in the darkest place in the world. Not yet, but soon all that would be left was to give up. In March 1946, Robert Odell walked into Creek Haven Elementary with a shotgun and a pistol. 12 children and a math teacher were never seen again after the tragic events at Creek Haven. Odell was arrested immediately following the massacre, having fallen down a flight of stairs. When asked why he had committed such an act, he simply smiled and refused to answer. Within the year, he was executed. Since then, Creek Haven has undergone significant changes. Once a thriving mining town until the 1970s, it was abandoned after the ore was depleted, leaving the remaining residents to seek new opportunities elsewhere. The town now lies in ruin, overtaken by nature, with the old buildings still standing, including the school, which has become the focus of ghostly rumors since its abandonment. Supposedly, the spirits of the children who lost their lives can still be seen around the school. I'd heard bits and pieces about Creek Haven since childhood. My dad was born there, but the family left long before the mines dried up, leaving him with no memories of the place. My grandmother, however, had spent her whole life there and had even been in the school during Odell's rampage, a part of her childhood she never discussed. As part of a film class assignment, I decided to shoot a mini-documentary on Creek Haven and its supposed hauntings, starting with an interview with my grandma. While recording her, I could hear the thin line of disapproval in her pressed lips as she told me, "We don't say that name." She advised against going back to Creek Haven, citing terrible memories that left her ruined. When I asked her about that fateful day, she shifted uncomfortably and revealed, "Of course I do. I knew all of the victims. Some had been my friends." "You don't forget something like that." "Never." Her voice was still raw with pain long after the event. I shut off the tape, sensing the sensitive nature of our conversation. Afterward, she offered to bake cookies for me to take home, and I chose not to mention Creek Haven again. However, I remained determined to pursue the project. I enlisted my friend Nicole as my camerawoman, and we set a date to drive out to Creek Haven. Despite its bloody past, neither of us truly believed the place was haunted. My documentary aimed to explore the town's history and the emergence of its urban legends, titled The Making of a Ghost Town. On the day we left, the sky was overcast and humid. Nicole's Jeep's air conditioning was broken, leading her to complain throughout the 30-minute drive. I was too focused on my notes to pay much attention, only looking up when she abruptly stopped, causing my seatbelt to catch me as I jerked forward. A barrier had been erected at the road leading into Creek Haven. I got out to film the roadblock and the pothole-ridden pavement behind it. With a bit of urging, I had Nicole maneuver her four-wheel drive around the flimsy barricade, capturing shots of the trees lining the way and the first glimpses of sagging, dilapidated houses in the distance. Once we reached what was once Main Street, I compared old photographs of the town with the scene before us to create a montage of then and now shots for the documentary. "When do we get to the school?" Nicole asked eagerly. She was anxious to get to the haunted part of our adventure. I sighed, recalling my grandmother's grim expression, but I also understood that what was a painful memory for her was simply our school project. We followed a map down bumpy streets toward the school. It felt eerie to drive past sun-bleached buildings, each still displaying their business names as if waiting to reopen. As we turned down Dogwood Avenue, we reached the low stone walls surrounding the school. A two-story building with red brick and blackened windows. The parking lot was a messy patch of weeds growing through concrete. Nicole parked outside the front doors, one of which had been shattered, allowing us a glimpse into the dark corridor beyond. Just as I climbed out, Nicole grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "Someone's in there." I squinted into the shadows and gasped. The outline of a person was peeking out from behind the doorframe. Frozen in place, we waited, but the figure didn't move. "What should we do?" Nicole whispered nervously. I leaned forward to get a better look. "It could be a homeless person," she suggested. Doubting her guess, I opened the Jeep's door and raised the camcorder to my eye. Cautiously, I climbed the short stone steps leading into the school. As I approached, my suspicions were confirmed. I laughed and waved for Nicole to join me. "It's a mannequin," I called out. "A mannequin? That's supposed to make it less creepy?" she replied, sounding doubtful. After some convincing, she joined me, and we stepped through the broken glass. The dimly lit interior was shaded in grey, filtered through the grimy windows. The child-sized mannequin we had seen from outside stood just inside the first doorway, labelled Front Office, while another adult mannequin stood behind the desk. A few more mannequins were seated in chairs outside a door marked Principal. "What the heck?" Nicole exclaimed. I laughed nervously and continued filming, while she stayed close behind me as we ventured further into the school. A few child mannequins dotted the hallways, one at an old-fashioned water fountain, while others formed a line outside a classroom door. Inside the classroom, an adult mannequin faced the chalkboard, surrounded by child mannequins seated at desks, all covered in dust and age. "This is way too weird," Nicole said. "I'm going to wait outside." I urged her to stay, assuring her it was just some remnants of a prank. "Whatever," she said, retreating toward the front door and leaving me to call after her. As she exited, I pressed on, filming each room, where mannequins were positioned to mimic a typical school day, teachers leading classes, an empty library with a lone mannequin behind the checkout desk, and a cafeteria where child mannequins scattered around the tables appeared to be eating. Despite the creeping goosebumps on my arms, I convinced myself it was harmless. After all, I wasn't a little kid afraid of dolls. I continued filming, passing faded posters and peering into every doorway. I made my way to the stairwell leading to the second floor, taking each step slowly and cautiously. At the top, I found another adult mannequin standing with its back to me, a stick resembling a handgun taped to its waist. Disgusted by the symbolism, I shoved the mannequin aside and it fell with a crash, echoing through the hallway. I hurried past its legs and continued down the hall. Unlike the first floor, there was only one classroom filled with mannequins. An adult mannequin stood at the front, half-turned with its arm raised, pointing toward the blackboard, while every seat was filled by a child-sized counterpart. I began to pan the camcorder across the classroom when a loud bang suddenly came from the stairwell, making me jump. "Nicole," I called, but she didn't respond. I felt icy sweat break out on my neck. chewing my lip as I tried to rationalize the noise, convincing myself it was just something I had disturbed. My thoughts were interrupted by the soft murmur of childish whispers coming from the classroom. Slowly, against my better judgment, I glanced back inside. All the mannequin heads had turned toward the door, their blank faces fixed on me. I stumbled back with a short cry, fumbling my camcorder. A creaking sound echoed from the classroom, and suddenly I couldn't remember how to move my legs. Heavy thuds echoed in the hallway, growing closer, accompanied by a deep, guttural growl. Panic surged through me as I tore myself away and ran down the hall, screaming. I stumbled over the legs of the fallen mannequin, barely managing to catch myself on the railing before tumbling down the stairs. I looked back just in time to see dirtied, elongated fingers gripping the doorframe, dragging itself into the hallway. I bolted down the stairs 2 at a time, yelling for Nicole to start the car, convinced that the mannequin was chasing me out of the school. We screeched out of the parking lot and fled Creekhaven, adrenaline still pumping through me. I couldn't bring myself to review the footage for a few days, waiting for the fear to subside. Nicole refused to watch it, saying she'd have enough nightmares as it was. Finally, I sat at my desk with all the lights on, plugged the camcorder into my computer, and skipped over the initial shots of the town until I reached the elementary school. Seeing the mannequins again made my heart race. I fast-forwarded until I reached the classroom on the 2nd floor, where another bang jolted the camera, sending it out of focus. The camera briefly focused on a plaque outside the door, and I caught the name Parker before it resumed moving, everything becoming a blur. The only glimpse I managed to capture as I frantically escaped was of the adult-sized mannequin in the hallway. I ultimately turned in a documentary on a much duller topic, but I saved the footage from the school in a hidden folder. Aside from Nicole, I only dared to bring it up with one other person, my grandmother. I know you don't like talking about Creekhaven, but does the name Parker mean anything to you? I asked. Grandma nodded subtly, whispering, "Mr. Parker, he was my..." By 1870, most of Canada began adopting the long drop technique for executions, a method that has become quite familiar. This procedure involves a prisoner standing on the gallows with a noose around their neck. When a trap door opens beneath them, they fall, breaking their neck and losing consciousness almost immediately. While they suffocate during this unconsciousness, it is deemed more humane than other methods. In stark contrast, the hoisting technique is considerably more barbaric. Here, the condemned starts on the ground, a rope is tossed over a high beam and tied around their neck, and then they are hoisted up. This process can be excruciatingly painful, and according to reports from survivors, can last upwards of 10, sometimes even 15 minutes if the person struggles in the right way. "That's sick," I remarked, yet my companion smiled. "Sorry, can't help it," she replied, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't worry, I'm not judging," she continued. "Hangings are a morbid business, but they always draw a crowd, especially here. They feed a need for the local folk who can't make it to Halifax." According to her, the warden liked to hold surprise executions, climbing to the top of the watchtower early in the morning to ring a bell, signaling a hanging. Once the courtyard filled up, he would order the kill, observing from above and waving at the crowd like an emperor in the Colosseum. As I gazed at the watchtower, a knot formed in my stomach when I thought I saw 3 shapes peering back at me. I blinked, and they were gone. "Just clouds," I assured myself. But my companion, as if reading my mind, leaned in and whispered, "You know, there's a rumor that the tower is haunted by a ghost with many faces." I shuddered. "You're making that up to mess with me," I said. She shook her head. "You can ask around. It's been spotted a few times in recent years. Last I heard, it was seen by a group of teenagers who jumped the fence." A few raindrops fell as I asked what it looked like. Some say it's a fisherman, others say it's a man in prison guard attire. Everyone agrees. Its face changes every time you look away. 1 second it has a beard, the next it's bald with a scar across its eye, and so on. See, this is why I visit these sites, I replied. Does it attack? I asked. She shrugged. Some say those who see it are doomed to hang themselves. Others say it's just a myth. As she raised her palms toward the sky, it began to rain. Let's head inside, shall we? I nodded. The gas lights were still mounted on the walls, but they had long since run dry. Thankfully, we had brought flashlights with us. We explored the cells with their low ceilings and tight walls, the old chamber pots, and the beds made of dry straw. We then moved on to the chapel, a simple room with a cross, and finally to the offices, where she shared more history about the region and the prison. However, I won't bore you with those details as they're not relevant to this story. I think you'll find this room quite interesting, she said, stopping at the door to the watchtower. So far, the rooms had all been intriguing, and I was eager to see why she considered this one special. She fumbled with her keychain, guessing which key fit the lock. It didn't take long before the lock clicked open. As the door swung wide, an odd, suffocating feeling washed over me, as though I had inhaled a cloud of volcanic ash. "Welcome to the watchtower," she announced. There's nothing brave about stepping into a dark room in the middle of a century-old prison. Logically, there's no real danger. It's only scary if you trick yourself into believing it is. Really, an old building is just an old building. Despite knowing this, I hesitated. My feet felt like cement blocks, and the threshold seemed like a force field holding me back. I had no idea where this apprehension stemmed from, only that it felt overwhelming and palpable. "Oh dear, worn out already?" Ansley teased playfully. "We can go back if you'd like." I shook off the nervousness like a dog shaking itself dry. "No, sorry, just lost in thought," I lied. Stepping inside, I felt a wave of vertigo wash over me. The watchtower was only about 3 stories high, but the spiral staircase leading up and the way the room narrowed made it feel like it reached as high as a lighthouse. Once the lightheadedness passed, I noticed something dangling halfway up. The noose. A very large noose. Squinting, I circled around, trying to determine if it was a trick of angles or if it really was that large. The more I looked, the less it seemed like an optical illusion. My voice caught in my throat. "Why is that so big?" Ansley inhaled deeply as if to scream, but instead she began a story. The key for this tower was lost for the longest time. It was only when the Historical Society began looking into the prison that it was discovered in the ruined west wing in the warden's office. It's since been moved, but there was a chest here. She pointed to a spot at the foot of the wall, where the bricks were brighter than the surrounding ones. In it we found the warden's journals. He was, she narrowed her eyes, a very sadistic man. I circled the room again, trying to view the noose from every angle. There was something captivating about it, like a tire swing of death. He was obsessed with figuring out how many people he could hang with a single noose. Ansley continued. I blinked, incredulous. "You mean before having to replace the rope?" She shook her head. "No, not the amount of hangings he could perform, but how many people he could hang at the same time." The statement took my breath away. Hanging more than one person from a single noose at once. Could it even be done? She motioned to her neck. He started with 10 people, wrapping the noose around their throats and hoisting them up. It took 5 guards to lift the weight, but the cords snapped before they could see what would happen. He tried again with 9 people, and this time the cord held. Unfortunately, with 9 shoulders pushing the heads apart, there were gaps. It was impossible to make the noose tight enough to hold all the heads in place. People slid through the cracks, making room for more to escape until they all did. I tried to imagine standing in a semicircle with 9 other people, and I swear I could feel the rope around my neck. I wondered how it felt to be lifted, certain that everyone was about to die, only to slip to freedom. Would it be a relief or horrific? So we started at 10, then 9, and went down from there. She nodded. He tried 8, but faced the same problem. Then 7, and then 6. His experiments caused some damage. The fewer people being hanged, the longer it took for someone to slip free. It all got worse when his subjects dwindled to 5. Why is that? Well, by 5 he was able to pull all the prisoners high into the air before any of them could slip out. If you didn't die hanged, you died from the fall. So 5 was the lucky number. It was strange. I felt like we were being watched. I kept looking up at the top of the watchtower, expecting to see someone staring back down at me. No, dear, she continued. He wanted people to die from the noose, not the fall. He got stuck on 5 for a while, convinced it was a question of tying the noose correctly. He was determined to make it work, but he had only a limited number of prisoners to experiment on. Warden Murray began collecting people he didn't think would be missed. I winced. What did he do when he ran out? She sat on the staircase and glanced up at the noose. The room, despite being exposed to fresh air from above, felt stale and suffocating. Warden Murray began collecting people he didn't think would be missed. Homeless people, transients, anyone who didn't have a family or wandered too close to the prison. I rubbed the back of my neck. Damn. Now this may be unrelated, but I've uncovered reports of whole families going missing around that time. Their belongings untouched as though they had been taken in the middle of the night. I can't confirm good old Warden Murray was involved, but it's interesting how the timelines match up. Purely conjecture on my part, of course. But how many transients can you kill before you run out? And still, with all that death, none of his 5-person experiments worked. It felt like a boa constrictor was trying to squeeze my esophagus. Why was the air here so thick? Murray sounds like a sick bastard, I said, my voice hoarse and dehydrated. Ansley nodded. He was. It took him months to give up on testing the noose with 5 people. He nearly lost it when he went down to 4, and they still escaped. To make matters worse, no one survived the fall at 4. At least with 5, the first person was sometimes able to make it out with broken legs. At 4, it was hopeless. They could be hoisted faster. Then they could resist. At that point, the test was less a matter of life or death and more about preventing their escape. It was torture, I said softly. You could say that. She pushed herself off the stairs and straightened her back. After that, he was utterly obsessed with collecting enough people to try again at 5, but word spread through the community about the poor souls disappearing. And the townsfolk? They got scared. They sent letters to the Crown, demanding an investigation, claiming the warden was stealing people from the streets. I felt sick. And he was... Exactly, she said, spinning the story. But because of the outcry, he became desperate. So desperate that he devised a plan to get out of trouble. I wondered how many families could have been saved had anyone been able to stop Warden Murray. He could have tied that noose around his own neck and called it a day. So he turned to crime, I asked. To make matters worse, he turned the prison into a make-believe dungeon, no longer just for serving time. There was a bed in the corner and an actual chamber pot where prisoners were forced to sleep if they had too much to drink. For all intents and purposes, he turned the tower into a torture chamber. I cringed, imagining the smell. He started abducting victims who weren't just passing through town, but people from far-off places as well. City folk and their families. His reputation for brutality grew, which only attracted more victims, until he turned on the city folk, I murmured. Exactly? He began leaving witnesses to tell their friends how their loved ones were going to live in comfort and were free to come and go as they pleased. Those left behind told tales of darkness and despair, and with each disappearance the circle grew tighter. It sounded like a tale spun by a master storyteller, too ridiculous to be real. "Is this why they say he lost his mind?" I asked, now feeling overwhelmed with disbelief. Ansley shook her head. "He lost it well before then. He kept luring in victims until he'd finally gone mad. And those last few executions before he finally did were more like a final stand against a losing battle than true attempts at scientific experimentation. So how did he die?" "Eventually, the Crown sent someone to investigate the letters. His days were numbered." I shivered. "They say he decided to hang himself right here in the watchtower, and his body was left hanging from that noose for days." The watchtower's walls felt tighter, closing in around us. "Did he?" "It said the noose lost its power that day," she said quietly. As we prepared to leave, I realized I hadn't been breathing well. "Are you all right?" she asked, eyeing me closely. I nodded, but I didn't believe it. Something was wrong here. After some time, I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a hangover. "Hey, let's check the basement." "I thought we did that already," I replied. "Not this one." When she said basement, a part of me felt ill. "What do you mean?" "Right beneath the watchtower," she said, pointing to a wooden hatch. "This one doesn't lead to the dungeon. It leads to the dead prisoner's hold." I froze, watching her pry it open. "I thought there was no hold. Rumors," she shrugged. I knew better than to go back down, but my legs didn't listen. The adrenaline surged, pushing me forward until I was standing beside her. She descended the stairs, the beam from her flashlight illuminating the cramped space. I followed, trembling slightly as I scanned the walls. "This is crazy," I said, shaking my head. "Come on," she encouraged, leading the way. Each step felt heavier, the air thicker. It felt like the walls were closing in. A cold chill ran down my spine like icy fingers tickling my skin. As we reached the bottom, the room opened up into a larger area, with old crates lining the walls and something dark pooling in the center. "What's that?" I moved in closer, the beam of light catching something familiar, like hair, but darker and frayed. I was frozen, unable to breathe, panic swelling in my chest. "Looks like we found some of the unfortunate souls," Ansley said softly. I shook my head, wanting to deny it, but the weight of the truth was heavy. We were trapped in a horror story, the chains of the past binding us to the present. A sharp crack echoed from above, and we exchanged glances. "Did you hear that?" Ansley nodded, her expression shifting to one of concern. "We need to get out of here." But as I turned to leave, the darkness around us felt alive, wrapping around me like a vice, the shadows closing in. The noose's grip tightened around my throat as panic clawed at me, whispering that we weren't alone. "We're not alone!" I gasped. Ansley pulled me back. "What do you mean?" I stumbled, feeling something brush against my leg, a cold, clammy hand. I screamed, the sound echoing in the empty space, the past rushing back to consume us both. I felt the noose tightening, the weight of those lost souls pressing down as the shadows whispered their torment. And in that moment I knew we were part of their story now, forever entwined in the dark legacy of the Watchtower. He died soon after leaving Tenzin with the uncomfortable knowledge that every man in our family now carries a curse upon his shoulders. We are all doomed, every single one of us. Every man in the Nakamura family begins to see these creatures on their 29th birthday, and misfortune befalls them for the rest of their days. Sometimes they go weeks without an incident, sometimes just hours. It seems to vary from member to member, but as generations passed, all the men reported seeing these beings around the time they reached 29. When they attempted to find the priest who originally placed the curse to apologize, they were unable to locate him or anyone who knew him, rendering their search ultimately fruitless. Each member of the Nakamura clan dealt with the curse in his own way. Tenzin tried to maintain the family property after the loss of his father, while his younger brother committed suicide on the night of his 30th birthday. Manic and wild, he plunged a blade into his belly right in front of his children, gurgling as blood seeped through his teeth and stained them a dark coffee red. His son would later report hearing an incessant buzzing in his ear, experiencing itchiness on his skin, and developing bumps that he couldn't rid himself of. He eventually threw himself into a river at the age of 34 as part of a cleansing ritual, one he unsurprisingly didn't survive. My grandfather Hiroshi took his wife and my father across the ocean to the U.S. during World War II, declaring a desire to escape the atrocities of the Empire. He sought trade out west and assisted the British government as a translator. However, my grandmother recounted that he secretly hoped the sightings would stop if they were blessed by another priest, and could start over in a new land where these yokai could not follow. He was wrong. Within a decade, Hiroshi was driven to the point of insomnia, refusing to sleep for fear that the spindly creatures lurking in the gutters would rise from the drains to claim him. He began to neglect personal hygiene, washing only when he could take the bucket into the living room to avoid looking into the drain. My father, Julian, was obviously concerned as he watched his father devolve into a mere husk, babbling about the rattling pipes and the incessant singing that only he could hear, emanating from the neighbors above despite living on the top floor. This madness ultimately led Hiroshi to a heart attack when I was just a boy. I remember the drive home from his funeral, a rare sight as Shinto burials are not common where we lived. Although my dad and I were more American than Japanese, we still upheld tradition. My frail Nana looked at me from her wheelchair, shaking her head as she pointed at me while speaking to my mother. I recall my father's white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel as he screamed in broken Japanese for something to get out of the way, despite the roads being clear. I remember the car toppling over the embankment, the inertia washing over me as my small body was tossed around like a rag doll, and my dad's promises to fix the passenger seatbelt haunting me in that moment. The quiet aftermath was filled with soft, pained breaths in the wreckage as I looked ahead to see my father's mangled body crawling back to the dashboard, only half of him making the return trip. He ignored the whispers he repeated, interspersing a small chant until his breathing grew shallow and blue lights blinded him from my view. He was 31. And to the best of my knowledge, he never displayed the anxiety or distress that previous members had shown. In fact, he seemed immune to it all, proud of his work and a diligent parent, always striving to be the best he could. Yet perhaps it was that desire to ignore the fate bestowed upon him that ultimately led to his end. Now here I am some 2 decades later, and it's my turn. My brother Harry went missing a few years back, though my mother insists it was his wanderlust and that he's probably somewhere in South America, stoned out of his mind. But he never took narcotics for fun. He always used them to quell his paranoia of something following him. Harry routinely believed that the stars followed him wherever he went, particularly one that glowed a sickly magenta and hummed incessantly. He described it as a presence that grew larger as he tried to outrun it. I once asked him why it terrified him when it was so far away. But when his eyes met mine, I understood that there was something else in the sky, something he wouldn't dare describe that was after him. Oddly, when he waved me off, taking a drag from his cigarette and choosing not to discuss it further, he bid me farewell, setting off backpacking and telling Mom he needed to find himself. He hoped the stars wouldn't follow him there. Strangely, I guess I had prepared for this my whole life. Indulging in horror has been my forte, to the point where I made it my full-time job, weaving experiences from my life or the lives of those I knew into terrifying tales, all the while knowing nothing would ever match what was waiting for me. It all started last year on my 28th birthday. I woke up the following morning with a start, hearing whispers in my ear, faint but unmistakably alien. "You shouldn't take your medication today." Confused, I tried to determine whether it was the remnants of a dream. But seeing no one around and hearing no follow-up responses, I got out of bed and went about my day, cursing myself for forgetting my medication as the feeling of something watching me enveloped me. From there it grew like a cancer. Over the weeks I felt something cold wrapping around my neck and squeezing my stomach, jolting me and causing me to drop something valuable or stumble in the street. Once I even crashed my car into the back of my mum's. With every momentary fright and creeping sense of dread, I could feel this entity grow in confidence and power. I spent the remaining part of 2019 researching our family lineage, desperately seeking a way to alleviate the curse or atone for my ancestors' sins. Yet, after numerous overseas calls to our relatives in Japan and lengthy conversations with my nana, it became clear that I could run, plead, or bargain, but the curse would not relent. "You can run from it, plead with it, bargain with it," my nana rasped, sadness gripping her kind but aged face. "I lost my husband and my son to that wretched curse. I couldn't bear to lose you too." I remember taking her hand and smiling in gratitude, but when I looked up at her, instead of her face, I saw a grotesque shape stretched over her skull, hollowed eye sockets with amorphous shapes undulating in the black pits, layers of rotting flesh stretching over gangrenous muscle and blackened bone, melting with mold and fungal growth. It cocked its head toward me, grinning as it whispered, "You will never face her again." This was the crushing nature of the curse. I backed away, softly apologizing to my nana in a cold sweat, my chest tightening and my vision growing blurry. I was having a panic attack. Managing to reach my car, I punched the steering wheel in frustration as my mind shot back to my father's final moments. Did he see what I saw now? So it went. The curse kept its promise, first taking my nana until she died that spring, then moving on to my cousins, aunts, uncles, and finally my mother in July. I've come up with every excuse possible to avoid seeing her, but I think as my age approaches 30, she senses something is off. I finally told my partner about it in the week leading up to my birthday. She tried her best to understand, but when she suggested I speak to a therapist, I knew there was a barrier she would never cross. I couldn't blame her. To the outside world, it must seem as if our family simply has a history of severe mental illness on the male side. Maybe we do, or perhaps it's just latent in our minds until we mature in our mid-20s, with the 29th birthday being a self-fulfilling prophecy. Last week, a few days shy of my birthday, the curse visited me in a dream, draped in a cloak of muscle and guts, peering from the tip of its cloak to laugh at me. "You want to be free?" My desperation was palpable. A solid year without proper sleep or communication with my family, with no reason to live. I nodded, tears forming in my eyes at the prospect of freedom. "Then go to where your father lost his life. I will return once I came and find a new victim. I will leave you there." I didn't tell my partner. I left her a simple note with an excuse for why I had to go, deactivated my social media, and set off for the location of my father's accident. Roosevelt, for those unfamiliar, is a countryside area situated 100 miles from the nearest city, sprawling with hills and surrounded by nature. It also has many quiet country roads with vast open fields, the kind where my father lost his life. As I drove down the dimly lit roads, The curse whispered in my ear, "Just a little bit further. You'll be there soon. You'll find someone new, and I swear I'll let you go. You never even bore a son. It's no fun when you don't react anymore." Exhaustion, misery, and hunger gripped my soul as I sped up, desperate to rid myself of this entity. My mind raced with thoughts of how my predecessors had succumbed and how many more would fall. That's it for today's episode of Shadowed Secrets. But the mystery doesn't end here. If you're craving more spine-chilling stories, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. Have your own theories or a story to share? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear what's lurking in your mind. Until next time, remember, some secrets are better left in the dark. Stay curious, but stay safe.